Understanding the human mind is the holy grail for cognitive scientists. If you want to know what makes people tick, you need to understand their inner mental lives. And of all the achievements of the human mind, reasoning seems like the peak. Without reason, we wouldn't have any social regulations, we wouldn't have any laws, we wouldn't have any science or technology. So out of all the achievements that the human mind manages to bring about, reasoning seems to be center stage. Other achievements like creativity and the imagination put in an occasional appearance, but reasoning is like the star of the human mind's show. So I wanted to find out how people reason. Let me give you an example of how important it is to be able to reason. Suppose you work in a nuclear power plant and you're carrying out a very important safety test. You need to figure out how, if there's a power cut, you can keep the reactor cool. And you figure out that the turbines themselves, the reactor's own turbines, can probably do that job if they keep rotating fast enough. So you're going to carry out this safety test. You come in with the night crew, you're in the control room, and all hell breaks loose. There's alarms going off everywhere telling you that things are going wrong. The steam pressure is too high, the release valves aren't working. But you manage to calm everything down, you stabilize the system, and you press on with the test. And a little while later, alarms start going off again, and this time they're telling you that the turbines aren't rotating fast enough. What should you do? Well, the logical inference is that you should stop the test. But that's a hard inference for us to make. It's hard, particularly in the context of everything that's been going on all evening, where there's been alarms going off, but you've been managing to control it and calm things down. And so most of us don't make that inference. And in fact, the workers in Chernobyl who were faced with this situation didn't make the inference to stop the test in time. And major disasters happen because we all make mistakes when we try to reason. I really wanted to find out why we make those sorts of mistakes. So I started doing experiments with adult participants, volunteers. I'd get people to come into the lab and I'd ask them to make various kinds of inferences. And I'd give them loads of different kinds of situations. Chernobyl is just a good example. In one of the experiments that I did, I wanted to see what happens when your knowledge conflicts with logic. So I gave some participants really stripped down information, pared back, said things to them like, if the steam pressure is too high, you have to stop the test. And then I'd tell them, the steam pressure is too high, what should you do? And they'd all say, stop the test. It's an obvious inference, it's very easy. And I told other participants that same information, but I gave them additional information. I said things to them about how you'd fix the steam pressure. And then when I said to them, that the steam pressure was too high, they didn't make the inference. They were imagining other possibilities. They were imagining that they might be able to fix the steam pressure. Their knowledge suppressed the inference. And this gave us an important clue about reasoning. When people try to reason, they're not using logic. They're trying to imagine alternative possibilities. If you want to be really good at reasoning, you have to be especially good at imagining alternatives. What I learned from this was that, yes, reasoning is the star of the human mind's show, but imagination, creativity doesn't just put in an occasional appearance, it's there all the time. The imagination is behind the scenes, and in fact, it's directing the show. So that made me change paths. I veered towards studying the human imagination. And the imagination is one of the last uncharted terrains of the human mind. What I wanted to find out was how creating great works of art or literature or inventing new things is born out of our everyday imagination, the attraction that we all have to pretend, to fantasize, to create alternatives to reality, to think what if or if only. So I started doing experiments on the human imagination. Imagine for a moment that you really were in Chernobyl. How could things have turned out differently? There are striking regularities in what we all imagine could have turned out differently. There are fault lines in reality where we all zoom in on exactly the same juncture and say things would have turned out differently at this point. So I started asking people into the lab and telling them stories, and I'd ask them to complete the stories saying what if, or thinking about if only. And what I was interested in was whether you could shake up the fault lines of reality, because they seemed to suggest that the imagination was limited. And what we found was that you can sway people away from imagining the same old alternatives to reality. The fault lines aren't set in stone. They don't limit the imagination. They provide it with a coherent logic. So now what I want to look at next is what else the imagination secretly directs. Think of memory. We believe that we recall our pasts, but in fact, we reconstruct them. Or think of emotion. We experience emotions like regret or relief or remorse or guilt because we're thinking about what happened and we're imagining how it could have turned out differently. Or think about life without an imagination. After certain kinds of brain injury, some individuals lose the ability to create alternatives to reality. And that loss has a huge impact, not just on their thinking, but also on how they relate socially to other people. And now I believe that the imagination isn't an optional extra, something that evolved late just to entertain us. I think that the imagination is the very architecture of the human mind. It's what makes possible all of the rest of our mental life. Thank you.